Hi everyone, my name's Anna Leach. I'm here as part of the Data Analytics for Entrepreneurs series. I'm a lecturer of data visualization and been a data scientist for 20 some years now. So let's get started. I'm going to talk today about how data visualization aids in decision making. We're going to go through a process of understanding what data visualization is and how you can get started using your data today to make decisions. So first I'll begin by defining data visualization. Then I'll walk you through considerations around your data specifically and your audiences. I'll then give you some chart options of common and familiar charts, how they can be used or should be used, and ways that you can implement them now. We'll then go through some tips and cautions, things to consider as you're learning to walk through this process of data visualization. And then I'll give you some resources on how to begin. I'm going to begin with an intellectual acknowledgement here. While I've been working in data science for a little over 20 years, I've built what I know based on experience and anecdotal evidence, but I've also read quite extensively and went through many workshops. For this particular talk, I really pulled insight from these 4 books. Don't stress about writing them down in any hurry. I'm going to provide them as a reference at the end. So let's begin with defining data visualization. If you were to Google data visualization right now, just asking for a definition, you would get multiple versions of pretty much the same sentiment. Data visualization is the visual representation of information and data. This can come in the form of charts, like Gantt charts or bar charts or flow charts. It can also come in graphs. Think line graphs or slope graphs or scatter plots. We can also use maps to geographically represent data with an overlay of information on top of a map. This can be a global map, a state map where we're looking at counties, or even just streets, like for bike lanes. And then finally, tables. Tables give you more of a raw example or representation of the data. These visuals may be used in conversation, displayed for presentations, or used maybe in an infographic. Data visualization is a very useful tool for exploring and monitoring, as I say here, but also we could examine patterns in the data. So maybe peaks and valleys in sales. We can also look at the structure of our data. Maybe we have a hole or gap in our clientele or in our product line. We can also use it to monitor data over time or in real world applications and identify trends and outliers. We can also use data, which this is my hope for you, to tell a story. Data visualization makes data easy to understand. As humans, we process visuals 60,000 times faster than text. A thoughtful chart can communicate information showing trends, outliers, and patterns, as I said, way faster than a report can. These patterns and trends that we notice in visualizations help us to make decisions faster and more accurately. People are more likely to remember the information when it is presented in a clear and useful visual format. And another benefit is that data visualization facilitates communication between you, the person that knows the data very, very well, and the consumer of your visual, the person that may not know your day-to-day business inside and out. Okay, so now that we have a clear definition of data visualization, let's start to consider your data and your audience. So if you're comfortable, close your eyes and take a moment. When I ask you who your audience is, who you're trying to communicate with, who do you envision? Perhaps it's a client, whether it be an existing client or a group of clients or an ideal clientele. Maybe it's an investor. Maybe it's another business that you'd like with, or maybe it's you yourself trying to understand your business better so that you can make better marketing decisions. If you closed your eyes, please open them. Get out a piece of paper and write down that client, that investor, that business. Write down your audience. Use like just 2 or 3 words to describe them. Now take another moment. Think about what you need to communicate. With this audience in mind, what do they need to know? If you're trying to get them to come into your business, what information do they need? It's not just price. It might be what inventory you offer, what makes you a lead in that industry. What tone are you trying to communicate this information with? Is it excitement? Is it a need? Consider this information as we progress through data visualization and the choices you might make. Use this as your anchor or your goal. This is what I want you to be thinking about whenever you're deciding which data you're going to use and which data visualization choice you're going to make. Because once we have our audience, we have a focus there, and then we know what our audience wants to know or we think they need to know, that's when we can start putting data into charts. So how do we go about getting data? To locate our data, we can look in many places. We can explore the software that we use to track sales, customers, inventory, travel expenses, and etc. These data may be easily accessible from your computer in spreadsheets or as an output in the software that you use. Or perhaps it's actually in a paper, like a book or a register that things are written down, or notes that you've taken over time. Or maybe you don't have the data collected yet, and that's all okay. Now that you know what your goal is and you know what your audience is, you can begin collecting data to answer the question to meet your goal or that your business had. A little bit of caution here, and we're going to talk about it more in the next slide. Recording data requires that you record all of it, the good and the bad. We know that anecdotal records can sometimes be what we choose to collect or see, and then we have to think critically. What data am I collecting and perhaps not collecting that I should be collecting as well that could show the opposite or a different output than what I'm wanting? This is not meant to discourage you, but asking that you critically evaluate the data that you have collected or are possibly going to collect. This includes the data that your software collects. Well, this presentation does focus on data visualization, right? I want us to understand and think about the data pipeline. The information that we're collecting is about people or inventory or products or services. We collect this information and then put it into a format that a visualization can read. Maybe that format's in a spreadsheet or a software program if you're feeling that comfortable before we put it into a graphic. What we're representing in that graphic is actually the data itself, and it's our job and responsibility to make sure that that data truthfully represents the environment and the data that we've collected. All right, so now we're sitting with a definition of data visualization. We know the goal that we want. We know our audience. We have collected our data, or at least we started thinking about how we're going to collect our data. Now let's talk about the different types of options that we have and how we can choose the right visualization for the goal that we have set. The key is to match the visualization with your message. I understand there's a lot of charts going on this slide. It's almost intentional to give you a broad sweep of what we're going to talk about. We're going to look at each one of these individual graphics and talk about how they can be used, some of the benefits, and then possible pitfalls from using them and ways that we shouldn't use them. When I say these are common or familiar, that's a good thing. We want to start with common and familiar charts to display and give our information. Why do I say that? Because if it's a familiar chart or a commonly used chart, our audience or consumer is already going to be familiar with the format in which the data is presented. Therefore, they can look at it and instead of trying to figure out what the data visualization is and what data it represents, they can more quickly go ahead and make a decision based on the visualization they're seeing. So instead of them spending more valuable brain time on determining how to interpret the visualization, we can begin right away making decisions and answering questions. I use these visualizations all the time in presentations and in class and in any type of conversation around data visualization, with one exception of the pie chart, and I'll talk more about that. So let's begin by looking at a table. A table is a valuable way of showing raw data that is easily read. It's a great way for seeing multiple variables across different sets of information. These are great for accurately grabbing a piece of data or one specific number. In this example I have listed here, let's pretend that I own a gym called My Boxing Gym. And I'd like to see what the number of customers coming in Q2 that are new monthly and signed a monthly contract. I can easily go to the section that says Q2, new, and then drop down to the line where it says monthly and say free. If I needed a quick answer or if I wanted to show this in a way that was just numerical, a table is a great way. A table is not great for showing comparison. Whenever I'm trying to compare, did I have growth from Q1 to Q2 to Q3, Q4, my eyes have to scan and do math. This is a lot to ask of our brain when we're trying to make decisions and think about things. So instead, we could use a chart or a visual aid for this. One example could be a pie chart. Pie charts are useful for proportions. Whenever I need to show and allow somebody to quickly estimate the proportion of a specific category, I use a pie chart. So if the goal here was to know the proportion of my clients from my boxing gym that have an annual contract, I can use this pie chart to visually show this large yellow area here are my existing clients that have an annual contract, so I know that they're going to be there for that full 4 quarters or full year from when they sign the contract. This is a great way to compare within that existing client enrollment against what percent are monthly and what percent just drop into my gym. But if I want to compare maybe Q1 to Q2 to Q3 to Q4, I wouldn't necessarily use a pie chart for that. I would actually discourage it. And some authors will tell you they don't use pie charts at all. For comparisons, we would want to use a bar chart. Bar charts allow us to think about comparing categories. So for this example, I just made this chart that's sales versus company, and the companies are A, B, C, D, and E. Notice how you read this chart. You went from the upper left-hand corner, most likely, and zigzagged down through the chart. The color of the chart, while this is just the standard default color for Google Sheets output of charts, brings your eye close into the grid. And you're noticing the pattern, the direction of the data. You're noticing that A is smaller than B, is smaller than C, and so forth. Think about whenever you start to play with these different charts, or whenever you're seeing charts in the wild out in the data that you consume regularly or watch on the news or read or see on your social media platforms. Think about how you read the chart and how you interpret the information that you're gathering there. Now, this bar chart is great for comparing and quickly seeing what's the smallest and what's the largest. An alternative to this type of bar chart for comparisons is also a horizontal bar chart. This is great for categorical comparisons. So if we're thinking back to that first pie chart that I showed 2 slides ago, where I wanted to know of my existing customers, what percentage of them have an annual contract by quarter 1. And then I wanted to compare that to the other quarters, quarter 2, 3, and 4. This horizontal bar chart, again, thinking about how we read this chart, starting in the upper left-hand corner, is drawing our eye in to the category that the information is laid into. So when we looked at the previous chart, I'm just going to go back for a moment here. We see that we're comparing the direction of the data, how it's growing in comparison from A to E. For this chart, a horizontal bar chart, we're starting with the category itself and reading across to the data. So it's more focused on the categories and how we compare in between them. It's a sneaky way to look at the data that's very similar, just with a different visual. Another type of chart that we can use, but something that we would use for over time, is called a line chart. So when I looked at my information about my sales or my clientele that are existing customers that have an annual contract, I looked at it over 4 different quarters to do a comparison, but I also wanted to look at categorically how they differ between the different types of contracts that I offer in my studio. Perhaps I'd want to look for patterns over years. Perhaps I've had my studio open for 5 years and I want to see what type of growth we may or may not have over the quarter 1 from year 1 to year 5. A line chart would be excellent for this. Line charts allow us to connect points over time and look for peaks and valleys and trends. So for example, I created this synthesized data set to represent sales by month. This has January through December for 2 years. You can see that there's a big valley right around June and July, and then a nice peak in September and October. This is quickly read just by this visual examination and using this line chart. Okay, so we've decided that if we want proportions, we use pie charts. If we want to do comparisons of categorical variable or sections, we can use bar charts, either the stacked or the horizontal. And then over time, we can use line charts. Another type of chart that we could explore, and the last one for us today, would be the scatter plot. A scatter plot is a little bit more advanced when it comes to a data visualization. It's actually giving us information on relationships between 2 variables. So for this example, if for my boxing studio, the data that I created, I wanted to see if there was any relationship between the age of my clients and the average class attendance per month. So if I'm using a type of software or system where my clients can log in when they come into class, I would have this information about my clients based on the information they've provided with their contract, and then I would have the information when they've logged in, attended class. I could then look at and compare the average class attendance per month over a certain period of time, maybe a year, maybe 3 months, whatever I choose. So what I'm seeing here in this scatter plot, for example, is that my students that are in this 7 to 12 age range right here are attending class a lot. But my 20-year-old clients have a lot of variability. My clients that are in their 40s are also attending class a lot. And then I have an outlier here with a 62-year-old client. So is there something I can do? Is there a decision I can make with these 20-year-olds to perhaps encourage them to come to class more often? Put out a survey asking them when they would be willing or able to come to class, or if there is more information or more class times that they need to have. This would give me a way to discuss with my clients their needs and adapt my business for them. Okay, so we've talked about the definition of data visualization, your audience that you want to consider, some different chart options. But I would also like to give you some tips and some caution around the data creation and visualization that you're going to provide. First and foremost is to keep the visualization simple. We're going to want to add clutter and additional information to the visualization because we are excited about this process. Cluttered is an issue with the visualization because, as we said before, where brain is processing the information that we're getting, we're starting in that upper left-hand corner and reading in a zigzag motion. If our eyes are distracted or pulled away from information, then we're going to be distracted and pulled away from the point of the visualization. We can remove clutter in different ways depending on what software you're using, but always start simple and carefully consider what additional pieces of information you're going to bring in. Do you need a logo? Do you need to have additional grid lines? Do you need to have additional space? Eliminate unnecessary grid lines or 3D effects. Unnecessary grid lines can be, again, very distracting to a scatter plot or a bar chart or even a line chart. If they're too dark, it's going to pull away from the different colors that you're using for representing your data. 3D effects is something that sometimes gets popular and then fades back out of popularity. The problem with 3D effects on charts and visualizations is that they can actually skew the perception of the information. I've got an example for you of that in a couple slides. Watch for redundancy. So this one is about what information you have on the visualization that maybe you don't need, and this helps us to remove clutter. So for example, if I label my x-axis along the bottom with the months and the year, I do not also need to have a legend and a title that includes that information. If I'm only displaying 1/4 of information, for example, I would put in the title that it's Q1 or the subtitle that it's Q1, and I wouldn't include that in the axis. White space is your friend. So white space is the area around the charts that sometimes we want to fill with color or shapes or logos or emblems or sources. Also, white space is that space in between charts whenever we're presenting them. Sometimes we're going to include multiple charts in a presentation or a visualization. And if they're overlapping or too close together, our eyes are going to immediately start to compare them. Whereas we want that white space to differentiate and distinguish the information between the other ones. You're also going to want to simplify legends and labels. I have a tendency to do that one specifically with legends. If I want to really explain what the information is in the chart, I might put too many words in for the legend and explain the information too much. When it really in a legend should be one word to describe what that category is of your data point. Same with titles. Lengthy titles should be succinct and informative and not too long. You can use subtitles and you can make sure that your information is clearly visible within that chart without having to add too much text to that visualization. We can use color to draw attention to specific parts of our chart. We can use color, shapes, size, and layout. So with our data points, thinking back to that scatter plot, we could use shapes like triangle or squares or crosses in addition to circles to differentiate the data that we're displaying. So we can get very layered in the information we share. We just want to be cautious with it. However, if we want to highlight something or bring something forward, we could also use color, shape, size, again, to really draw attention. Alignment and spacing is also an important thing to consider whenever we're designing our visualization. There's a book called Design for Non-Designers, and I'll link that in the references at the end, that is very useful in helping us think, if we're not a designer, how we could improve a visualization. The example on the screen here in the bottom right is something that I do with my students in class to really make something ugly. We have here a sample data set from a software package that's open source called RStudio or R that we work through RStudio. Here we used a software called ggplot to create a plot of highway miles per gallon versus the displacement of the vehicles, how much it weighs. We then broke it into 3 categories by drive, whether it's four-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, or rear-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive. With intention, we picked some really contrasting colors. We highlighted the title in blue, and we discussed the design issues with this visual. While the use of color is helpful to draw attention, it also muted the entire plot and almost made it ugly. There's another type of resource that you can use. Again, I pointed that out in the beginning, and I'll have it at the end, where Caro, who wrote a book called The Truthful Art on Data Visualizations, and the Intro to Data Visualization by Healy, where they talk about some fundamental principles around data visualization choices. If you're interested in those books, they really are good reads, and they go into detail about making decisions around color, alignment, spacing, and proximity. Think about your data visualization as part of a story. I need you to, you're going to gather your data and you're going to put together this data visualization. Take a break, step back from it, zoom out, and recall what your goal was. What's the intention of the process that you're going through here? What story are you trying to tell? Think about what is the conflict, issue, concern, or question. Think about what you want to communicate to that ideal client or ideal audience that you visualize. What is the resolution? If my concern is that I am not providing enough class times in my boxing gym for the demographic of 20 to 25-year-olds, what do I need to do to show that that's happening? And then what can I do next to make that change? What's the story with that data? You'll put it together just like you have a story arc. Begin with that conflict, begin with that issue, begin with that curiosity that you have, and step through exploring your data with visualization, step through those different pieces until you find a resolution or an answer to your question. Some common mistakes that can come up based on the things that I just told you to consider whenever you're embellishing or making your visualization really shine. Use color, shape, size, and layout, but with intention. Specifically choose a color because you want it to stand out, because it's the same color throughout your story if you're using multiple presentations, because you're considering whether or not it contrasts with the points, the lines, and the data that you're showing. Similarly, don't use too many colors. If we use a bunch of different colors, we're going to distract our audience, and we're going to turn something that is simple and clean and succinct into something that might be of bad taste, as Keeley puts it in his book on the introduction to data visualization. Additionally, think about accessibility. If we, when we use colors that are within that same kind of green-blue or red-green, we might not be providing data that can be consumed by everyone. If there's a color blindness issue, that information might be hidden, not intentionally, but part of the color choices. There are tools available in different types of software, depending on what you decide to play with when you're creating the visualizations, that can provide colorblind filters. There's also websites that allow you to use a colorblind filter on your visualization so that you yourself, if you don't have a color blindness, can see what the visualization looks like to them. If that visualization color choice is too close, like if we're using all variations of yellow, but it's not a gradient scale, but supposed to be categorized, we can change it by using shapes so that we can adjust the points to be, instead of just all the same color circles, they could be, as I said before, triangles versus circles to differentiate in addition to color. We can also use different pieces of the chart labeling to actually label directly on to the bar chart, for example, instead of just relying on color to represent categories of our information in our data. Accessibility is also important when we think about screen readers and how that information is displayed if you're putting it in an online format. Be thoughtful about how you lay your data out and label it with respect to how those might be interpreted. And finally, consider truthfulness. So as I mentioned before, we have that data pipeline and we're taking our information starting off with our clients, products, services, and etc. We know that data inside and out anecdotally, just based on our experience. Then when we pull it through and put it in a way that the computer can read it into a visualization, make sure that the translation makes sense. Think critically about your visualization and what it says. Is it misrepresenting the data or is it skewed? So for example, a bar chart. Bar chart should always start at 0 and never start at a different value. So if I have a bar chart that goes from, thinking back to that A, B, C, D, E, goes from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I cut that bar chart off at 1 and represented that information visually for whatever reason, it would misrepresent the truthful difference between A and B, because it would look like A starts at 0 because it's at the bottom of the bar. Bar charts should always start at 0 for that reason, because they are the full volume or the full count of information that we want to compare. Some other examples of things that we must consider whenever we're creating our visualizations and trying to be truthful with them are pie charts. As I mentioned before, some authors and some data scientists will not use pie charts for different reasons. I say use pie charts with caution. So in the previous example, the pie charts that I created had varying difference in proportion. Before, the yellow was very big, and I believe it was the blue was very small, and the red was kind of like at 14% or so. You could easily see that there was a clear difference between all three of those categories. Whereas this visualization on the left-hand side, let's start with that one, I've added labels in because if you look at these three categories of yellow, red, and blue, if I asked you to give me a general estimate about each section, you would probably say it'd be about 30%, but you wouldn't be able to accurately tell me that it's 34%, 33%, and 32%. But if my general goal of my presentation and my plot is to show that proportionally these three categories are pretty close together, then this pie chart might be an accurate representation of the data and meets the goal that I'm trying to hit. So that's why I say use it with caution. If you're trying to say that something is much larger than another category, then a pie chart might work. If you're trying to show that they're generally about the same, a pie chart might work. But if you're trying to use this to give an accurate estimate of a category, this is not the way to do it. I would highly recommend moving to a bar chart. And specifically maybe a horizontal bar chart if you're going by categorical data or data that we can put into categories. The visual on the right is for us to discuss 3D shapes. So on the right-hand side, if you compare, these are the exact same plot made in Google Sheets with a 3D application applied, like a 3D chart applied to the one on the right. Visually, yellow and blue look slightly bigger than red, and that's just because of perception. By tilting the visualization back a little bit, it's going to make the volume or that area look slightly different. The book on storytelling with data by can't pronounce her last name right now, sorry, talks a lot about this use of area and space in visualizations and how it should be avoided because of the way the brain processes that information. There's a hierarchy of perception when it comes to visualizations that allow us to more accurately or quickly make decisions based on the visualization simplicity and the way it's designed versus a more complex visualization that's not cluttered, that might be a nice visualization, but because of the nature of it being area, it takes our brain and our eyes more time to figure out what information is there. So then you as the designer are taking extra time to add labels and think about what you're trying to accomplish with this visualization and maybe not meeting that goal. So perhaps a different visualization is the right answer when we come to something like this. Another conversation around truthfully representing your data. The chart on the left-hand side, well, let me back up. So I want to pretend that I have a health website, and I've created a program for being able to bench press this lifting weight to increase the amount that you can bench press over 20 weeks. The goal or idea is that you buy my training program and that you follow the instructions from week 1 to week 20, and you'll be able to increase how much you can bench press over time. I want to talk about here about making sure, harking back to that data pipeline, we capture all of our data and information and plot it so that we're truthfully representing the data that we have. So I know that, especially when it comes to this kind of data, we may not have it for every single week just because we forgot or we were sick or whatever. But let's just pretend that I was able to capture the data every week. The visual on the left-hand side is going to show some of the plateaus that naturally occur in any environment, right? Some days we just didn't make it to the gym enough, or we weren't able to lift enough, we didn't eat enough, whatever it might be. So there's going to be these natural plateaus and peaks whenever we're lifting, but we would expect that general slope to go up based on this line chart on the left. The arrows are pointing towards these plateaus in time where we're just not having as much growth. The picture or visual on the right-hand side, the line slope, cuts out places where there's a plateau in the growth of the bench press process over time. What this does is create two very different charts that misrepresent the truthfulness of the data. On the left-hand side, you can see that there's growth with plateaus, which is normal in any journey of changing body composition. Whereas on the right-hand side, by removing those sections of data and those plateaus, because we think maybe they're not important, I'm saying this is an innocent thing that I'm doing, we misrepresent the journey of the person over this 20 weeks through this training program. If you have a critical audience, investor, business person, they may ask questions about why is there a gap in the data between week 6 and week 11? Why is there a gap in the data between week 11 and week 16? This could cause some credibility issues and questions around the truthfulness of the data that you're representing. So for safety, for credibility, and for complete understanding, be truthful in representing your data and think about all of these pieces. Okay, so this is great information. We know what data visualization is. We've thought about our audience and our goal and our problem. We've got some charts in our tool belt now that we can start to work with. We've got careful consideration around truthfulness and representing our data accurately and different things about specific charts that we want to consider before deciding to use them. How do I even begin? Just start. It's just that easy. It sounds almost too easy, but the idea of crawl, walk, run, fly is very true. Start with something very simple. I know for some people, the data can be daunting, confusing, maybe overwhelming. Determine one question that you have that you would like to answer. And this could be something very simple. It doesn't need to be something big and grand that would, change the marketing strategy for your business or change the type of product that you bring in line or convince an investor. It might be something simple like, do I need to add an additional class? How well is this specific product selling? Those types of things. Go through the process that we did today. Determine your goal, determine your audience, visualize who you want to talk to, visualize what you want to answer and how you want to answer it. And then find that data. Where do you maybe have gaps in data collection? So for example, if I go back to my boxing gym, and let's pretend like I'm a startup company, I can't afford to have a check-in system for my clientele yet. How am I going to be able to say who's been attending and who's not? That might be a manual process that you start doing. Perhaps it's a sign-in sheet. Perhaps it's recording it right before class starts or right when class ends, based on your memory. But at least you're starting. You're getting an idea of where to begin so that you can start collecting your data. You'll then put that into some sort of software and play around with the information that you have. So you might start with Google Sheets, and you might put the information in there, and you might find out that that is the wrong format and the wrong information, and that's okay. That's where we always start. There's going to be a lot of trial and error using any of this software. Data science is an entire field. There are experts out there that you can seek out through YouTube videos and those different places. But the person that's going to know your data the best and know what to look for is you. So start by playing around and exploring. See if you have friends or buddies or family members that would be willing to help you think this through. Once you've played around with creating different visualizations after you've collected your data, make something. Sheets in Excel and some other different types of software out there have interesting, usable interfaces. So you'll load your data and then start clicking around, and they'll even suggest different types of charts. Now, based on what we've talked about today, you'll know which charts you're really looking for. Like if you're looking for something over time, you're not going to use a bar chart. You're probably going to use a line chart. If I want to do comparisons, I'm going to go to a bar chart. Start with these common ones and use trial and error. Play around. You're going to get frustrated. It's going to be maddening sometimes, but it's going to be worth it. Or maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be great. Maybe you'll be a natural. Once you have a visualization, go talk to somebody. Find a trusted colleague, a friend, a family member, anybody, even your dog. Say out loud what your goal is, who your audience is, and then show them the visualization and ask, what do you think this does? What do you think this means? What do you take away? Does this meet my goal? And then try again. Try again. The best way to do this process is just by experimentation and doing it, asking yourself the critical questions about the visualization. As I said throughout, there were different pieces of information that I used to influence this presentation and that I've relied on throughout my career. If you're looking for a great book that introduces data visualization techniques, there's a book called Storytelling with Data that has all kinds of information in it, and it's less technical. That one is by Naflick Cole. She has a website for storytellingwithdata.com where she has not only that book, Storytelling with Data, but also a couple other books, some workshops, some downloadable materials that you can play with and explore. There's also a website for evergreen data analysis that goes into data and analytics and visualizations for businesses that is really helpful and straightforward. And it's in a blog format, so short readings and applicable ideas. I mentioned the book Design for Non-Designers by Williams. It's available also online and very helpful for thinking about the different design aspects. So once you've leapt past that hurdle of what data do I collect, what visualization do I choose, what chart do I choose, what graph do I choose, and now you're starting to really tweak and get more custom and specific on your visualization. This is when you can go to that non-designer's design book where they talk about different principles like contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. If you're ready to start diving into using software, maybe a little bit more complex and requires some coding beyond Excel or Google Sheets, you could explore Data Visualization's Practical Introduction by Healy, where it's a step-by-step process discussing some of the things that I talked up today about perception, as well as what makes a great visualization, and then builds on that with some guides. Then there's, if you're interested in more of the art of visualization, how visuals can be visually pleasing and very useful. Carol is a great book, The Truthful Art of Data Charts and Maps for Communication. Again, I think that's available through Google Reads. I think I found it. I get it through my library. All right, and lastly, so once you've gotten the hang of this, right, and we're building and we're now flying, you could also explore the different types of charts that exist out there beyond the familiar ones that we've discussed today and that you'll continue to play with. To explore those and the usefulness or use cases of those, I really do enjoy the Data Viz catalog. It's a website. You obviously, and when you go to the link, there's like, I want to say 30 to 40 different types of visualizations. Each one is visually represented by a graphic. And when you click on that graphic, it takes you to another page that explains what that visualization is, gives a use case scenario, and then lists the different ways that it can be used. So for example, for the bar chart, you click on the bar chart and it would say bar charts are great for comparisons, and here's an example of how to use it, and here's some software that you can use to build this visualization. Okay. Thank you so much for your time and energy. I really appreciate everyone that made it to this space, and I'm here for questions. Moderator, I see that there's a question in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and answer that if that's okay. Okay, hello. Is it easy to break into data analytics for someone with zero experience and a bachelor's in economics? Are these professionals still in demand and well paid? Thank you in advance. Okay, so I can speak to the ease to break into data analytics. Data analytics, especially data science in general, is a rapidly growing field. I think that ease is dependent on what you're interested in, but someone who has a bachelor's in economics is going to have exposure to that analytical side of the world. So I would think it would be ripe for exploration. As far as paid, I'm not sure. I don't have a good pulse on the job market at the moment. I do have students as well as colleagues when I worked in previous jobs that have explored different realms of data analysis and where they could work. I do see from their experiences, government work, at least here, has that kind of mid-pay scale like in academics. But there are other companies, if you're willing to work for kind of those larger scale companies that I believe pay very well. Are professionals still in demand? I would say yes. It's a hard field sometimes it might be difficult to find a middle to higher level job. It starts at that entry level and then climbing in, but I think that it's still in demand. But I say that with kind of caution. I'm not really on the pulse of that. Okay, question 2. Which tools did you use to create the graphics and chart? Which free tools do you recommend? Excellent question. So for this presentation, I used Google Sheets to develop all of the charts where it wasn't labeled that it was sourced from external. with the one exception. The one pink ugly chart that I made was made in R. I chose those because they are free, because I can work with them. Now, the free tool that I would recommend starting with is Google Sheets. Um, and I would start with really simple data and really simple questions and inquiries and build from there. Sometimes it can be confusing as to which is the X, which is the Y, how to label it. So you're going to have to spend some time investigating that um, and exploring that realm. Again, you're going to know the data, your data, better than anybody else is going to know it. So you're going to be able to see pretty quickly where something doesn't look right and where things are off. Excel is also an option if you can get access to that Microsoft license. And then if you're ready, willing, and able to explore R or Python, there are lots of available resources for using R and Python for visualization. I myself am more comfortable in R than I am in Python, but I have colleagues that swear by Python. So, okay, question 3. I found your approach to telling a story with data very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I'll be thinking about it more. How applicable do you think this could be for articles in academic journals, and have you ever tried it in that context? Let's see. All right. So for academic journals and that type of kind of world, we still use visualizations to tell the story, but what you're going to have in an academic journal is 3 to 5 pages to tell the entire story. So your visualizations can be broken down into 2 sections, and this is talked about more in that storytelling, using data for storytelling by math. Storytelling with data, brain. Um, you can use data visualization in an exploratory way. This is when you're really trying to understand your data and how it's broken down versus an explanatory way. This is that forward upfront data visualization. What's going to go in that journal is that explanatory, and the text is going to do that storytelling bit. I think academic journals specifically that are that I've enjoyed reading have a storytelling element. The introduction sets the stage. What's our problem? What's our issue? The literature part is going to find that gap. Where am I missing this information? Or why is this information all about this particular thing and not about this particular thing? And then the next piece of the story is like, in comes my method. What am I going to do and how am I going to approach it? And then based on what I tried, this is what happened, is that kind of like story arc in an academic journal or in a literature piece of literature. The visuals that we can use can get more more sophisticated in an academic journal or in a publication like that, because we can support what the visualization is showing with text. So if I use a visualization to represent p-values, I don't have to use a plain old table. I can use some sort of visualization that shows where those p-values are, the shape of my data, and that type of information as a complement to what I'm saying in the article. Of course, this is depending on the journal. Okay, I hope that helps. Thank you, really useful, especially that it's not on the chair. You're welcome. Thank you. Comment 4. How can I critically evaluate charts or graphs made by my colleagues in order to use them in my reports? Excellent question. So I think it's the same way you should treat your own visualizations once they're completed. Take a few minutes, stop and ask questions. I almost said just like critically look at them, right? But that's what you're asking. So we start with having a conversation with your colleague. And sometimes this can be uncomfortable, and sometimes, depending on your colleague, it can be great. In a previous job that I worked at a different university, I had a great group of people to work with, and we would create different reports and visualizations, and then kind of pick each other about them. So I would sit with my colleague Bob and say, hey, Bob, I see that this says, that the number of students that are enrolled take this many classes on average. Is that what you're trying to say? And Bob would say, no, Anna, that's not what I'm trying to say. Or yes, Anna, that's precisely what I'm trying to say. Having a conversation with people is sometimes not the easiest thing to do, but the best thing to do to critically think about it, and really explore what your reports and visuals are trying to say. Pushing back on what you understand, and even the way you frame it empathetically, like, this is how I understand it, this is how I'm seeing it, this is how I am interpreting what you visualized here, can open the door for conversation, hopefully. I hope that helps. Sometimes we have both quantitative and qualitative insights. Do you have tips on how to bring those together in one visualization? Yes. So visualizations can be useful for both quantitative and qualitative data. Whenever I have, let's say, whenever I'm using quantitative data like count, and you notice that outlier that I had, for example, in the scatter plot, comparing relationships between age of my customers and number of times they came to boxing class, that I had that like 62-year-old client out there. If using that as an example, I would add some a label or a textual component to that point, like that outlier, and say, like, maybe that outlier I know personally, they were sick or had an injury, and I might label that. It's like illness, injury, this is Mr. X, and I know that whatever. So using that piece of qualitative to label your data or highlight, so not just colors, specific information because you know more about it, or you want to share more about it, or it reaches your goal, is how I would bring that quantitative and qualitative together. Great question. How do you decide when it's better to show the raw numbers versus relying on a visual summary? It really depends on the context of the conversation that I'm having and the audience that I'm having it with. For example, if I'm working with people that know the data, also know the business, know my goals, I'm probably going to bring a table and talk through that, maybe with one complementary visual on something that I want to emphasize. But if I'm working with somebody that doesn't know my data, is really interested in a focal point and not multiple pieces of information like a table is going to show, I'm going to bring that in a clean, concise visual to have that conversation. I don't want to bring too much information in. I don't want to overwhelm them. And I really would want more of that visual summary, as you say. Okay, thank you.